as everybody starts looking towards the next budget that is going to be presented in India, which is in a few weeks' time, actually, well, actually less than that, we really have to look at what the fiscal policy of this government has been. And very broadly, one can argue that it is not necessarily an austerity budget. We have not had austerity budgets as such. We've rather had what I would really call class-driven budgets. These are budgets that have been directed towards incentivizing and subsidizing the rich and large corporations and putting much greater pressure on both the poor and the middle class. So it's an interesting combination in that some budgets of other governments, and even of this government in the past, have sometimes prioritized the middle class relative to the poor. Here we have a wide canvas of those who are being discriminated against and a very clear privileging of the very rich. And this is personified, I would argue, in what the central government calls welfare. So first of all, you see, it's a complete reversal of the way the Indian government had been forced to move in the previous decade. From 2004 onwards, we had a slew of rights-based legislations. And this is critically important because it transfers the responsibility on the state to deliver rights. Right to food, right to employment. We wanted a right to health, we didn't get it, but right to information, forest dwellers' rights. So in other words, there were a bunch of legislations that were designed to recognize that every citizen has a right, and it's the government's duty to actually deliver on that right. We've gone back, unfortunately, we've regressed to anything that the state provides is seen as a gift. We're back to the patron-client notion, the my-bap state, where anything you get, the right to food, for example, which is a law now, it comes with the Prime Minister's face on it. The packets of grain are seen as a gift from Modi ji to the people. So it's a complete reversal, really, of what any democracy should have, which is a clear recognition of the basic rights of the citizens and the duty of the government to actually provide those rights. Now, that reversal also comes with another thing, which is while claiming they're dramatically increasing welfare schemes, they're actually reducing them. And they're reducing them by reducing the per capita spending on each of these schemes. So they may claim, for example, the cash transfers, the Kisan Yojanas, which were supposedly 6,000 per year. Shrinking numbers of farmers are getting them, and they're not getting the full amounts either, even of that which is dramatically eroded by inflation. The Ujjwala scheme, and a very important and necessary scheme, which would provide gas in every household so that women do not have to walk long hours to collect fuel. An initial cylinder is given. Thereafter, the price is so high that most households do not buy a replacement cylinder and haven't got one. Then the next time they get this free cylinder is before the last general elections. So it tells you a little bit about the attitude to welfare. Perhaps the worst examples of this decline in public spending, which is projected as efficiency, as greater effectiveness, is in the food and NREGA systems. Now, the right to work, we know it's inadequate. NREGA is not as good as it should be. It's not as extensive. It doesn't cover all adults. It promises only 100 days. In fact, it's never delivered more than 50 days. It's in the region of 40, 45 days on average across India. And the wage rates are still well below the minimum wage rates of most states. So in many ways, it's a lacking program. But the denial of rights under NREGA, under this government, have been extraordinary. Entire states have been deprived funds on really genuinely spurious allegations of corruption, because there is some corruption in that scheme in every state, including in BJP-ruled states. But for example, West Bengal has simply not got money at all for NREGA, which means that the people cannot access those work sites and what is their right as a citizen of India. But more than that is the exclusion that has come about through the biometric requirement, the Aadhaar-linked biometric, which is not just misplaced, it's actually obscene. Across the world, we know that around 20% of biometrics does not match, which is why China, for example, abandoned a biometric identity system. Now, a country as large as India, imagine 20% of the population, your biometrics won't match. And this is disproportionately the case for manual workers. So when manual labor has to put its finger, which gets changed through constant use, and it doesn't match, they are denied their rightful payments for the work they have already done. And we have so many cases of wage payments being denied across the country, but again, largely in the states, BJP ruled states that are trying to cut back on this. So the biometric requirement has been a huge, huge way of actually distorting the system, reducing the payments and reducing the rights of the workers, actually. So it's not an efficiency at all, it's an exclusion. Similarly, with the National Food Security Act, the introduction of biometrics has once again meant, first of all, it's assuming that ordinary people are the ones trying to scam the system. Whereas we know that most of these scams in even food distribution occur at the middle person level, in the intermediaries. And some states like Chhattisgarh reduced that dramatically through simple things like, digitization of the amounts, weighing of the trucks at periodic points, and so on, that allowed for a much better and more efficient delivery. So I'm not saying you shouldn't use technology, but use the right technology, the one that is appropriate and will solve the problem. Instead, what have they done? They've insisted on the biometrics. Once again, it often doesn't match. And then those people are simply denied their rations. On top of that, we haven't had a census, as you know, since 2011. We are still operating on a survey conducted in 2011-12 to identify the poor. So many changes have happened in the country since then, not just the demographic changes, but more households falling into poverty because of COVID, because of the dramatic increase in food prices since then, because of demographic changes, because of ill health that forces them into debt. And yet we do not identify those people. At a very crude estimate, about 5 years ago, it was estimated that around 100 million people are being denied their rations simply because we haven't had a census. I would argue the number is much more now, maybe 120, 130 million people. We have no means of knowing because the government still doesn't seem inclined to hold a census, which is the most basic information any government must have. So all this tells us that this is not a government that is interested in the actual welfare of the citizens or even in governing, because you can't govern if you don't really know what the country is, who the people are, where they are, how old they are, what kind of conditions they live in, and they don't seem to want to know that. Essentials, that goes for the right to food, which we are in fact currently underspending on for the reasons that I've described, the right to health, which we haven't a law for, but it is an essential item. We have one of the lowest public spending on health ratios in any part of the world. And relative to comparator countries, countries in the G20, other developing countries, middle-income countries, ours is abysmal. Central government and state governments together spend around 1% of GDP on health. I mean, it's obscene. And the norm should be a minimum of 3%, which our own government has recognized and which the BJP manifestos have claimed that they will do. But therefore, we clearly need a tripling of health spending, which, by the way, is also employment generating, which will solve another critical issue in our country, the employment problem. We have to spend more on education because the quality of the education we're providing is not adequate. We have not adhered to the right to education principles that are enshrined in law. We are providing substandard schooling, especially higher secondary schooling, and we're allowing the privatization, almost complete privatization of higher education, which has terrible implications because families go into debt, they sell their assets to put children through higher education, and then they cannot find jobs. So definitely a doubling of education spending. Massive increase in social protection. We are, again, one of the worst performing countries in terms of social protection. And we know that this is essential because around 90% of our workers don't have any legal protections. They don't have social security. They're informal. They don't have even leave or, even written contracts. So we really need to have a much more extensive universal social protection along the lines of a social protection floor that has already been laid out by the ILO, UNDP, and which the government of India has accepted. So three critical areas of dramatically increased spending. I want to highlight, and Narega, of course, we have to ensure that the government lives up to its promise that it is a demand-driven scheme and that all the labor budgets of every state will be met in full before the program is supposed to be going on, because that's what the law says, and yet the government has never done that. It is always in arrears with state governments, and it provides much less than even the state government's own estimates of the labor budget. So 4 clear areas of dramatically increased spending required. How is the money to come for this? And of course, every time you say you need to spend on these areas, policymakers come back at you by saying, where's the money? It's interesting because there's always money available when it comes to tax breaks for large corporates. We gave away 2.1% of GDP as a dramatic decline in the profit tax. And we didn't get an increase in investment after that in 2017-18. We give away huge amounts in terms of bank loan write-offs to large corporates, which are very quiet. They're not mentioned in the media. You give a loan write-off to farmers and there's hell to pay. Everybody's up in arms. But many, many multiples of that get written off every year as loans to large corporates. And some of the biggest ones are the beneficiaries of that. We don't even have to name them. Everybody knows who they are. What we should be doing instead, and what the government of India should do if its own declarations at G20 are to be taken at face value. We should be taxing the ultra-rich. We should be taxing large corporations. The G20 in Brazil, the meeting actually had a resolution that said we are committed to ensuring that the extremely wealthy pay their fair share of taxation. What would a fair share of taxation be? Let's say they get taxed the same rate as any salaried person, like you or me. In other words, we're not even asking that they be taxed higher. Let them just at least pay the same rate of effective tax as you and me. The proposal that was presented to the G20, and which the communique kind of hinted at accepted, was that for the extremely wealthy, in India, we could say maybe the centimillionaires in dollar terms. We already have, I think, 17 billionaires in India, but let's say we take centimillionaires, which would make around 1,000, maybe 1,500 centimillionaires, maybe 2,000, I'm not exactly sure about the latest Forbes list. But the idea is that you tax the equivalent of 2% of their wealth. Now, it doesn't have to be a direct wealth tax. It could be a tax on dividends. It could be a tax on rent, on profit, different ways of taxing them. But make sure they pay at least 2% of their known wealth as taxes. That would still mean that they are paying less than us in effective income tax, by the way. But at least it's something. It's a step forward. And it's not difficult to do now because we have the automatic exchange of banking information. And we have countries that tax the wealth of their tax residents wherever they are. So the United States, France, developing countries like Colombia, Brazil has a scheme it's about to implement. Tax their wealthy wherever they hold their wealth. So they can put it in Switzerland or in the Cayman Islands. We now have the exchange of banking information to allow us to judge that and tax them on that. A tax on wealth of that kind, a 33% inheritance tax, for example. The latest Oxfam report is shocking. It tells us globally that billionaire wealth increased 3 times faster in 2024 than it did in 2023. 3 times faster. Okay, and it tells us also that 60% of that wealth is not entrepreneurship and inventiveness of those people. It is inheritance, it is cronyism and corruption. And we can see that in India as well, right? I mean, we can see how it plays out in India. So we're saying an inheritance tax of 33%, which is it's not even an average, it's on the lower side of the countries that do impose inheritance tax. If you combine those two, some years ago, Professor Prabhat Patnaik and I had estimated just combining that 2% wealth tax and 33% inheritance tax would give you nearly 10% of GDP. Now, today, in fact, wealth is much greater than it was then. The wealthy that we calculated then, I mean, it's really a small fraction of the wealth they hold today. So, you could actually get potentially a huge amount, even if you're only partially able to implement such taxes. These are available. There are countries doing it, developed and developing. And there's really no reason for our country not to do it. Our government has gone on record saying they believe it. So there's no reason for us not to go in for taxation of very rich and of very large corporations.